Welcome to Mini Law School. What's an illegal distinction? Social enterprise. So happy to see you all here tonight. Thanks for your patience while we got started.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here with us today. Finally got the technology sorted, so ready to get started. So before we begin, we'd just like to recognize that Dalhousie University is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, and we acknowledge them as the past, present, and future caretakers of the land. This territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship with Mi'kmaq Maliseet and the Pasquadabe peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. We are all treaty people. We also recognize that African Nova Scotians are distinct people whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched that part of Mi'kma'ki known as Nova Scotia for over 400 years. Mi'kma'ki includes all of Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, part of New Brunswick, the Gaspé region of Quebec, part of Maine, and southwestern Newfoundland.
All right. So this is a slide that we include in all of our legal information sessions that we do with the clinic. If anyone has attended a legal information session before, you might have seen something like this. But it's important for us to know that by us sharing legal information about social enterprise tonight, that you understand that that doesn't create a solicitor-client relationship between us. We're speaking generally about legal information, and the only way for you to get legal advice is from your own lawyer, who can tailor this information to your specific circumstances and advise you about the steps that you can take. That's me. I'm Elena Kolazchuk, and I am the director at the Technology and Innovation Law Clinic here at Dalhousie Law School. I am a practicing lawyer. I have been a practicing lawyer for 10 years, and I updated this slide earlier today. My experience in private practice had me working here in Nova Scotia, in Ontario, and Quebec, and I am a former alum of Dal University. I'm so happy to be back in Nova Scotia and in this role in particular. Very passionate about legal education, experiential education, and access to justice.
And this is me. So I'm Leo Bourgeois, and I hold a Bachelor of Arts in Business Law from Carleton University. So before coming here to Dalhousie, part of the reason I came here is my family is from Cape Breton, so kind of had that relationship to the East Coast. I love it. I'm a senior law student at the Technology and Innovation Clinic, and I'm in my last year of study here at the Schulich School of Law. I'm really eager to support businesses that prioritize addressing social issues and foster community development through legal assistance. I have a history of kind of working for organizations in this vein. I did an internship at a legal aid clinic that provides services for people with HIV. And I'm really excited to be working with businesses as well as not-for-profits and charities. So a little bit about the clinic, just to give you some background about what we do, who we are, why we're here today. So we're a business law clinic that operates out of the law school here at Dow. And the clinic kind of has like a dual purpose. So the first is to really increase access to legal services. So we provide early stage businesses with a range of legal services that otherwise might be very expensive if you went to a traditional lawyer. So the fees are around $100 a month. And it also provides real experiential learning for students. So getting real practical experience, getting to work with clients before third year students go on to article and then eventually get called to the bar. So some of the services that we provide, and it's a little bit more than this as well, is general business structuring, incorporation. That can include as well, whether it's a charity, not-for-profit, or a co-op, which we're going to get in a little bit later. So structuring around that. We deal with a lot with contracts, limitation of liability, and we also focuses on services related to IP or for people who wish to develop, use, or wish to acquire information technology. So just to speak a little bit about my experience at the clinic, I found it such a wonderful term. I started in September to just build a lot of practical skills and also getting to work with organizations who might not otherwise be able to afford our services or for those who really have a social purpose behind them. And I just really feel motivated every day to work on these things, and there's been a lot of great mentorship. So we have a few polls today that are interactive. So if you have your phone here or your computer, we'd encourage you to join. You can just go to slido.com and type in the following number. It's always better if people participate.
And we do have a really good size here tonight, so lots of space to speak up and ask questions or make comments if you would like to. Just gonna grab my card.
Okay. Everyone find it all right? Sweet. We are good with some technology, as you can see. So the first one, question should pop up on your phone there. You can just put in kind of like one word or like a few words about like what does a social enterprise mean to you? Oh, didn't work.
Oh, no?
No. Huh. Maybe we aren't the best with technology. Doesn't have the
We tried our best to be as interactive with law as we could, but we have failed. But we'd still love to hear what your responses are, if anyone wants to share.
It's an enterprise, basically, usually a nonprofit base, where your primary goal is, let's say, for lack of a better term, a social good as opposed to simply profit.
Okay. So an enterprise with a not-for-profit base. Enterprise with not-for-profit base. Okay. What else? Social enterprise. Our social enterprise, they think.
Oh, so to me, it means a way of connecting with the community, creating opportunity for people. It's basically a business that has has a non-monetary goal. So, and for us, it means ways to be part of the community. So,
Business with a non-monetary goal, connecting with community, enterprise with a not-for-profit base. All great answers. Anything anyone else want to add? Oh, we can see you typing now. Yep.
I would say impact-driven or green capitalism.
Impact-driven or green capitalism?
Clean capitalism.
Clean capitalism. Impact-driven. All right. What else do folks think? Seeing some good words pop up on our screen here. So the larger the word, the more folks use that word. Is that how it works with the word map?
I'm not sure.
I know when I use word map.
I think so. It could have been the first person who typed as well. But yeah, I can agree with that too.
So we see just from the answers that were submitted as part of our fun interactive tool, people helping themselves, social, community impact, social goal, community, profit, good, social. So we see lots of those words coming up, which I think are really reflected in some of these statements as well.
Mm-hmm.
Feel free to keep contributing. Will it still catch responses as we go? Or
I think so, yeah. We could come back to it after.
And we are going to pull this up later as we kind of break down some of these concepts today.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of like what a social enterprise is, it can be a little bit like confusing on like what does that mean? Is it a legal thing? Is it its own type of organization? Is it different? Is it a purpose? So that's kind of like what we're going to discuss today is kind of like break that down and what does it mean? If there are multiple entities within a social enterprise operating for different business purposes, But I think a good place to start is kind of just like a Canadian law 101. Like we're here for many law schools, so I think it's good to kind of highlight some of this. So essentially the law is a set of rules and principles that just intended to guide or like conduct our society. And the good thing to be aware of is the difference between like statutory versus common law. So what we're mostly going to focus on today is statutory, which is, you know, some of the acts you might see that governments pass, whether it's the Nova Scotia government, the federal government, that turns into law. Where the common law is what will develop from courts. So when there's different decisions from a court, there's a principle of stare, it's called stare decisis. So essentially the last judgment of a court, usually the principles in there will be built upon in the following decision. So that also creates laws in areas that aren't necessarily captured by the statutes or its ways of interpreting the statute. And another really good area to be aware of is the difference between federal versus provincial. So there's acts that are federal and certain areas of the law that are covered by the federal government, while there's other areas that the provincial government has the authority to operate over the federal government, and that's just kind of set out in the Constitution. And then you might be asking as well, like, why does a distinction of a social enterprise matter? So there's a lot of reasons, and we've just highlighted a few here. So there can be funding considerations, whether you might be liable for certain aspects under different laws. There can be tax benefits or tax considerations, depending on the type of structure that you have, as well as like structuring. So what goes into what organization you might want to start, and what you might want to be considering, whether you want to have a charity or a non-for-profit or a co-op, multiple of them, or a business corporation. So those are some of the terms that we're going to get into moving forward. So this is just kind of like a spectrum of what a social enterprise can be. So you have on like one end, it could be like a charity or a charity operating a business. Well, you see like going down to the other end, it goes all the way to like a commercial corporation, or even just a corporation who donates to charity or is socially responsible. And kind of in the middle there, you also have non-for-profits and co-ops. So we'll get into that as well. So we do have a video to play.
There's a saying that it takes.
Do you want to introduce?
Does anyone recognize these folks on first sight at all? No? Yes? You want to tell us who they are?
They're Hope Blooms.
They are from Hope Blooms. So we thought this would be a really good time to, first of all, give a shout out to Hope Blooms. It's actually their, just past their 10-year anniversary where they appeared on Dragon's Den. And this is a clip from that. I encourage you all to take a look at it. It's a great, great clip to watch. But really, really suited to our context here today, to hear some things just to hear some of the terms that come up in the pitch. Now, of course, has everyone here seen Dragon's Den or is a little bit familiar with the dragons? So the dragons are investors, you know, most often equity investors. So usually people come in, make a pitch, they're like, I have the best new idea for whatever it might be, and they will make a request for an investment in their business. Usually, if someone is investing in your business, they're going to get something back, okay? If it's a loan, they're going to get interest back. If it's an investment, what do they get in return?
Equity.
Equity. How do we capture that sense of equity? What do they get physically or in a document sense that would show that equity? Does anyone know? Shares, exactly. So equity investors are shareholders, okay? Those words we can consider interchangeable for our purposes. So with this clip is a minute and a half long. I know that's very long in 2023 time, but if you wouldn't mind joining us for this, I think it's a really great example and a fun story. And do check out the folks at Hope Blooms. We're not related to them in any way. We just think there are some cool folks in town who make some delicious salad dressing from a garden that exists in the north end of Halifax. And it's youth run. But what a great example, just to even hear some of those terms that really reflect some of the stuff we were talking about. I just wrote a couple of them in pink on the board, but 5%, I don't want a royalty, partnership, distribution, profits, can I have some free salad dressing? These are all some of the terms, the deal terms that we heard thrown around in that context. What does this mean? 5%, I don't want the 5%. What are they talking about there?
For an investment. 5% ownership of the company?
I love both those answers. I don't think we know enough based on what they said. And was there something else as well? I'm sorry? 5% of profits. Yep, so definitely, I need more whiteboard, but never have enough. So yeah, we don't know enough yet to know what they meant by 5%, but I think all of you are touching on some common ways that that could be interpreted. 5% of ownership, so are they going to be a 5% shareholder in the business corporation that these folks have? Are they going to receive 5% of profits? And we're going to talk about what a profit is. Are they going to have 5% of control in decision making? What do they mean by that? What else did you hear in that video that sounded interesting to you, or that stands out in the context of social enterprise?
A lot of feel good, emotion, people being a bit teary and feeling great about themselves that they were able to help.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. There is a sense of like there's something neat and different and community focused happening here. And I think it's interesting with that word map to see that word good, you know, come up in the way that it did. I think that's a really interesting aspect of social enterprise for me. I think sometimes we can really say certain forms of carrying out activities are good and certain are less good. I do think there's more commonality between them all than we might appreciate at first glance. And I'm speaking about the legal structures that are involved. So we're going to tease some of that out. But a charity doesn't necessarily, if it's someone is registered as a charity, doesn't mean that that's good. And a business corp doesn't mean necessarily that those activities or the folks working at that business corp are bad. You know, it really is a spectrum, and people can make lots of decisions within any of the structures that they have, or multiple of the structures that they have, to carry out in creative ways what they need to do. Okay, I think that's like probably my thesis of the whole point of what we'd like to kind of convey today, or just to kind of plant some seeds on these points. I forget what the next slide is, but I don't know if it's Hope Blooms related. It's you.
Yeah, you're teasing it out. So yeah, so these are just like a few examples of legal structures, mostly that we're going to focus on today, but it really just goes to show like how many different options there are, how many different structures you could have. And the law will really treat a lot of them differently. So we're going to kind of analyze like what you might want to consider if you are starting a different legal structure, if you already have one, how the law might consider that, and like where the liability might come as well from that, and kind of like strategies to mitigate that liability, or kind of the way that you can really effectively conduct your own business. So speaking first about like unincorporated business forms, so these would be like non-corporations essentially. So the first one's a sole proprietorship, which is just like the easiest, kind of like most simple form that you can think of, and it's just essentially one owner who is the same as the business. So you just have your own business, you're not incorporated. It's kind of like very simple. And some of the benefits around that is you can flow through your tax losses from your other income. So that's kind of like why it can be really beneficial when you're first starting out and you might have a bit of a smaller business rather than much larger business. The risks associated with that, which kind of goes for this and partnership, which I'll touch on next, is that you can be personally liable. So it's different from a corporation in that the corporation's a different entity from the people who are owners, where a sole proprietorship or a partnership, the owners are the business. So if something goes wrong, you could end up being liable, maybe being sued, something along those lines. And then a partnership is essentially like two or more partners, and you can either be like joint or severally liable if there's an agreement in place that states that, and it will kind of set out the intention of parties. But the way that partnerships are considered is it's two or more people carrying on business with a view of profit. So that's how the law defines it. You don't necessarily have to have an agreement in place to be considered a partnership in the eyes of a law, but if you are going that route, it's definitely most advisable to have a partnership agreement in place so you can establish who's on the hook for certain stuff, who has like a certain percentage in it, those kind of things.
So those are our unincorporated business forms. And now I'm going to talk about unincorporated service organizations. So you might think about these as not-for-profits. I'm going to use intentionally even more broad language for this slide, which is service organizations. So just something that's not a business or not just a business. Okay? So there's two main types of legal frameworks that would apply to folks who are not incorporated as a not-for-profit, but carrying out, social purposes, community purposes, and whatnot. And that is to be an unincorporated not-for-profit. So you might have a board membership, you might have a constitution and bylaws and all that type of stuff, but you haven't actually applied to the government to recognize your organization as a separate legal entity. So we're going to talk more about that shortly. So in this circumstance, we'd be thinking about, clubs, service clubs are just, more ad hoc, kind of loosely formed grassroots organizations, which can also be well established and carry out lots of activities. There are many very active organizations who don't have legal structures or separate legal identities, and they carry out in these forms, okay? The other form, a little bit lesser known, but is by trust. And this would be, you can either have a written trust agreement or it can also be implied by conduct. So I think it's helpful. Do you mind just going back to the last slide real quick, Leo?
For sure.
So just as Leo kind of broke down like sole proprietorship and partnership is a little bit like a trust relationship, right? Like by agreement, or it can be implied by conduct as well. Very similar when we talk about service organizations that are organized by trust. Okay? So just want to make a couple of comparisons there. So all of these entities, thank you, we can go to the next slide, are unincorporated. So they are related still to the humans that activate them. There's no separate legal identity in place yet, but we're getting there.
So yeah, moving forward, kind of like building on that is incorporation. So you might be asking kind of like, what is that? Like the term corporation or incorporations thrown out a lot, but kind of looking behind it from like a legal perspective from what it is, it's considered like a form of association or organization. But the key thing here is it's created under statutory law. So you actually apply to the government to incorporate your business. And at that point, it's forms a separate legal entity or like personality that's distinct from its shareholders and members, who are essentially the owners of that corporation. And that's really like the key feature in the eyes of the law, and like probably like the main benefit to going the incorporation route is that separate legal personality. And then the shareholders and like members have limited personal responsibility for the liabilities of the corporation. So thinking back to those unincorporated business forms that we were discussing, you could be on the hook for things in terms of like the liabilities of your business, but once you incorporate, that risk is kind of minimized in a way. There are some exceptions, but that's kind of like the key feature. And it's not just necessarily like a business corporation or a large corporation that you might be thinking about. So there are corporations with share capital, so where you would have equity getting invested, you would issue shares, maybe issue profits out to the shareholders. Those would be kind of like your more standard form business corporations. And thinking back, we kind of highlighted there's differences in federal and provincial law, and both the federal government and the provinces have their own acts for incorporating your business. So there's considerations on what jurisdiction you might want to incorporate in. In Nova Scotia, for example, a corporation is referred to as a company, and you would apply to what's called the Registry of Joint Stocks under the Nova Scotia Companies Act. In contrast, you could apply to be a federal corporation under the Canada Business Corporations Act, which would allow you to carry out business throughout Canada rather than having to, if you incorporate in your province, you have to apply separately to provinces to operate your business there, which is kind of like one of the main benefits of going the federal route. There's also corporations without share capital. So that includes kind of like our not-for-profits. And similar to the business corporations, there's also different acts in the federal government and the provinces for incorporating those. So a not-for-profit in Nova Scotia is called a society, and you would register under the Nova Scotia Societies Act, while a not-for-profit is kind of like the federal aspect of that. So similar to incorporating under the Canada Business Corporation Act, there's a Canada Not-for-Profit Corporation Act. And the same thing goes with for cooperatives. So they're a little bit different than not-for-profits, which we're going to get to in a few slides, but they kind of have like a similar structure with the two different acts. So you could be, you could incorporate a cooperative provincially or federally. So just to kind of like highlight what the structure is of a business corporation. So essentially, like the main purpose is to make a profit and then to issue that profit out to the shareholders, who are essentially the owners. And these kind of corporations do pay an income tax. So at the bottom, you kind of have like the shareholders, who are the owners, and then there's directors who kind of like manage the company along with the officers, and then you'd have like your personnel, as well as like the public at the top, who you might be providing like a service to or providing goods to, which is kind of how you would get that profit.
And then we have not-for-profit corporations. So I hope the whole title of our lecture is starting to make itself known a little bit. We're talking about corporations generally. I think for so many of us, when we hear the word corporation, we probably think business corporation, maybe more so than not-for-profit corporation. So good to remember that we can have corporations that are either not-for-profit or for-profit, or like Leo described, with share capital, which would be the business side, or without share capital, which would be on the not-for-profit side. Okay, so just like Leo was talking about with our unincorporated business forms, our sole proprietorship and our partnerships. So one of the big sources of risk there is, of course, that folks carrying on those business activities can be personally liable. So that means if you sell a product to someone or someone visits your premises and hurts themselves, then you yourself can be sued, which means if you have to settle some sort of claim, that means that your personal assets, your house, all of that type of stuff could be seized or at risk. Little known fact, that can also happen for folks who are carrying on unincorporated not-for-profit activities as well. There are lots of liabilities that can arise even when we're doing community social purpose work. So we're going to talk about some of those key liabilities as well. But really, really, really important to know that no matter what type of activities we're carrying on, there could be legal risk. And sorry to be the lawyer in the room to say that, but I think the importance about knowing about these structures and some of the other tools we're going to talk about today is to protect you and all the folks you're working with so that you can keep doing what it is that you want to do safely and sustainably. So for not-for-profit corporations, very similar to how Leo described on the business corp side. So you'll have your corporate structure, you apply to the government to grant you your special legal status in your new entity. But on a not-for-profit side, the key thing is it's not for profit. And we're going to talk more about that as well, because not-for-profits can still earn money, they can make revenue, they can still pay folks, but they can't have profit, okay? So there's no share capital in this scenario, but just like Leo mentioned on the business corp side, you still benefit from that limited liability protection. Okay, so the members involved in a not-for-profit corporation would not personally, asterisk, not usually, not usually personally be subject to any claims, for what the not-for-profit corporation was doing. Okay? So we wanted to kind of carry over some of that visual representation of the folks involved in a not-for-profit corporation as well. So you see it's quite similar. So instead of shareholders at the bottom of the owners of the corporation, we have members, okay? They're not the owners in the same way, but they are the folks who the organization is ultimately accountable to, okay? So good to think about in that way. And we also have directors and officers on the not-for-profit corporation side as well. Directors on this side also manage the affairs of the corporation. Officers are your executives, often the public-facing roles. And then in the not-for-profit context, you have, yes, your personnel, but often volunteers in the mix as well. And you may have more or less interaction than a business corp might, but often more interaction with the public in terms of carrying out your social purpose of what it is that you're up to. Cooperatives. Okay. Who's familiar with cooperatives at all? Anyone here? A little bit? A little bit? Heard of them before? So Nova Scotia is a really neat place for cooperatives, and there are many cooperatives that are operational here in the province. So it's a really is a helpful business form or not-for-profit form to be aware of. It is something that, just like the corporation, a cooperative can be for business purposes or for not-for-profit purposes. You have the choice with them. But it's a little bit different in terms of how the structure or some of the values under the cooperative structure play out. So it is more considered to be more of a democratic form. So unlike with our share capital corporations, we might say, one person might get one share, but it comes with 10,000 votes, for example. You can't have that type of scenario in a co-op. One person gets one vote, right? So the intention is that there's more democracy in terms of the folks involved and the say that they get related to the activities that the cooperative can undertake. The key thing with cooperatives is, just like corporations, you still have that limited liability protection, which is great and can be very helpful. There are some restrictions to know about with cooperatives. So there are, and again, depending on whether it's the business cooperative or the not-for-profit cooperative side that you go, there's likely to be restrictions in terms of how much, retained earnings, how much excess you can leave in the corporation, in the cooperative without using it to carry out your activities, how much you can pay folks, how decisions are made around spending and that type of stuff. But it is a comparable form and good for everyone to be aware of. We'll talk a little bit about cooperatives today, but it's not the main focus of our remarks. But I thought it was helpful to know that it is an option that does exist, and it certainly is available to be used. There's certain industries where you might see cooperatives come up more than others. It's an option. Okay, and just to illustrate this across the cooperative business form as well. So you'll see we still have members who are the owners and the folks who the organization is ultimately accountable to. Still have directors and officers for personnel. Okay, so it's very similar structure, but just kind of how those people can interact with each other within what bounds is a little bit different in the co-op context. Amazing. Okay, so I want to talk just a little bit about the benefits and limitations of incorporating as a business corporation, okay? And I do recognize that the slide is pretty heavy on the benefits and low on the limitations. Don't let that influence you. All of them have benefits and limitations. It's all about what you want to do and how you want to get there. That would guide your choice. But the really, really key thing, as we've said repeatedly about corporations, is the limited liability protection that it offers to the folks involved. So that's super, super key. There is a certain also familiarity with dealing with corporations, especially if you're looking for partners or investors. They know what a corporation is. They know how to protect their rights in the corporation, that type of stuff. So it's an easy form. And I'm saying that thinking about co-ops. So a business co-op might be a little bit less familiar to some investor folks. Not to say they won't, get involved, but I would expect that to be a little bit less familiar to lots of investors. And they may also be reluctant to enter into a co-op situation where there's certain restrictions on what the co-op is able to do as well. Business corporations can make donations, and I think that's a really important part about social enterprise that can get overlooked, and I really appreciate the spectrum that Leo was speaking to. Social enterprise can take many, many different forms. So business corps, great. Business corps are in the business of making profit, excellent. You could share it. You can make donations. And beyond that, you can also sponsor other organizations as well. The nice thing for business corps when they sponsor, activities with a social purpose or anything like that is they can often write that off as a business expense. That actually might be more beneficial to the business corp than donating to a not-for-profit, okay? So really good to know that, because again, there's so many ways to get there, and it might, depending on the business that you're speaking to, if I'm a not-for-profit, I might explore that with them. We can do this as a donation, or hey, are you interested in sponsorship as well? We often talk about the benefit of not-for-profits and being registered as a charity as giving people access to more grants, and that is usually the case. Just also wanting to mention that there are lots of business grants available for businesses as well, and like especially in the time of COVID and all sorts of government programs related to that. There are lots of grants available to business forms, so you don't just have to be a not-for-profit or charity to access them. Other benefit, you get profit on this side. Profit is everything above, your net revenues, so anything above covering your own expenses. Okay. The limitations I'll point out for the purposes of our conversation today, there is ineligibility for lots of other types of grants, which we'll talk more about that. And while business corporations can choose to some extent to have a social or charitable purpose, they're not required to, and they're not told how to carry out those activities. But there is some choice in being able to make decisions about giving back, partnering with certain folks, devoting a certain percentage of proceeds to, a social cause that business wants to support. So there's lots of options there, but there's no statutory requirement for it.
So just kind of like moving in to like why, if you're in one of these organizations or even like the unincorporated businesses, why you really want to care about legal risk management. So it's essentially like how you're going to minimize any risk you might have from the legal perspective. So I know we were talking about when you're an unincorporated business, you can be personally liable. There's still a lot of instances where you're going to want to manage legal risk even if you are incorporated, especially within your own business. So we're going to touch on kind of like those areas of the law a bit later in the presentation, but just to highlight that kind of like in this day and age right now that social enterprises are facing kind of increased challenges and risks in delivering needed goods and services. Especially, we think back to COVID and kind of like the effect that's had on a lot of businesses. And there's also kind of like a more like litigious environment. So like a lot more claims going on, and kind of like a complex regulatory context. So even discussing today, all the different business forms that are available, what act might apply to you, what liabilities might be associated with that. It can be kind of difficult to navigate. And like a really good example of this is there's an increase of like class action lawsuits for not complying with privacy laws in this day and age. So we will touch a little bit more on privacy laws later on, but a lot of businesses or people think that they're not subject to privacy laws. And in most instances, any kind of like organization or business is going to be subject to a privacy law, because the way that it's considered in the eyes of the law is if you collect kind of any information about a person, personal information, you're subject to privacy laws, and you want to go ahead and implement mechanisms in your organization or business to protect that personal information. And if you don't, there can be consequences from a legal perspective. So it's really important to just be like familiar with the different legal requirements and related risks to the ways that you carry out, whether it's your purpose or your business. And essentially like the key to really managing it is being aware, but also conducting regular and like purposeful due diligence. So implementing effective policies, checking in with your staff, kind of going to like that point about privacy laws, making sure that you have a policy in place to protect any information you might collect. So even if you have like a website, for example, that collects information about people who access your site. So you'll want to kind of have things in place to effectively manage that risk. So here's like a few different strategies that you can take. So one is like the standard of care that you conduct your business or that you run your operations from. How much attention do you want to pay to really conducting things in a good way and minimizing your legal risk? And kind of having like good tools of governance can enhance that. So whether that's like a form of bylaws, internal policies, the way that you train your staff, those are really like key ways that you can minimize potential risk. So having like effective policies that set out what your organization is about or what your business is about, how's the internal process going to be managed, how are you going to train people, how are you going to interact with customers, things upon like those considerations and having them in mind can really minimize your risk. And then not just having them down in writing, but actually like implementing those policies and having effective practices to conduct your business in a purposeful way And you really want to be careful around like financial standards as well. So making sure that you're following the law in that respect, that you're being compliant with like tax. So we can also touch on that a little bit after as well.
All right, so we generally care about risk management because there's lots of liabilities out there, not enough time. But especially for those folks in the middle of the triangles that we were showing, the directors and officers, if anyone here is on the board of a business corp or a not-for-profit, any not-for-profit board directors present? Okay, a few, great. So it is those folks who sit on the board who have a duty to carry out the operations of the entity in the way that they must, and also who might face personal liability for certain acts of the organization. Okay, so with directors and officers, the word that we use, the legal term to define that relationship is called a fiduciary duty. And that's a really high standard of care that is expected between fiduciaries. So the directors have a fiduciary duty to the corporation or to the shareholders, to the members, to the charitable purposes. It all depends. But there has to be a lot of diligence in terms of how those activities are carried out. And it's the directors who, it's their job to make sure that there is diligence on that front. Okay. And then our last bullet here on this slide, just to draw your attention to it, lifting the corporate veil. This is a term that you might hear in the context of corporations sometimes. Does anyone know what that means, or has anyone heard that phrase before? Non-law folks. Pardon? Oh, I was so excited to hear someone said something. Anyone want to wager a guess? A non-law folk? Sure.
Not shareholders, but people in the corporation are allotted some sort of activity. And I know a lot of corporations don't have to reveal a lot of their income statements or things that would normally be required of, for example, sole proprietor.
Yeah, so it's really a way to we've talked so much about the benefits of incorporating, having a corporation, which would take all the risk from the people. But this whole lifting of the veil is actually lifting that corporate, I don't know why we use this term at all. There's no veil to lift, but it really does kind of collapse the benefit, or can collapse the benefit of that separate legal personality. Okay, so there's certain things that directors might personally be liable for. So if there's HST owing, or labor standards complaints, or oil leak on property that you're responsible for, those can all lead to personal liability. So even though you have a corporation, still your stuff, your home, that type of stuff could be on the line for those related types of claims. Really, really, really important to know this. And one of the risk management strategies that are available to lots of folks is insurance. So there is insurance available for directors and officers of boards. And that's one thing, I'd encourage everyone to get informed about. For some boards, they require it. Many people getting onto a board might require that the organization have insurance protection for them. So good to know that that's something you can ask for, and why it can be really important to have. Okay, so even when we have the corporate structure, it's still not a be-all, end-all form of protection. And just that last phrase at the bottom of the slide there, personal guarantee, that's another way to kind of not benefit from the limited liability protection of a corporation. If you personally guarantee what that corporation is going to do, you've made yourself personally liable. Okay? So I always like to mention this, especially I'll just use a small business context. But a small business, they've incorporated, they need to take out a bank loan. Great, bank wants to give them money, but there's nothing in the corporation for the bank to secure against. So they'll often have the shareholder personally secure that loan. Okay, so even though the corporation exists and there's limited liability built into that, as soon as you personally vouch for the corporation, you are also subject. Okay, so really good to think about those things. Thank you. All right, and then what is a charity? So this is kind of in its own category. And we're just going to finish a couple more slides and take just a couple minute break to take questions, and if folks want to stretch their legs for a minute. But first, we'll just spend a couple of minutes on what is a charity. So charities are not their own entities. It's a separate registration. Okay? So it's not, I would encourage you to think of it less as not-for-profit versus charity and more as registering as a charity or not registering as a charity. Okay? So you could have a not-for-profit corporation, you could have a not-for-profit trust. Either of those could take the additional step to apply for charitable registration and then get the benefits of registering as a charity, which we're going to talk about. But it is something else you have to apply and ask for the government to give you. In this case, it's to the federal government, specifically to the CRA, and you provide all the information to say, we're only conducting charitable purposes, here's everyone involved, here's all of our compliance, all lined up, and our finances and everything like that, and CRA will say, okay, you are a charity now, and now you can have all the benefits of that. So we'll talk about that maybe next. Okay, so wanted to kind of compare what a registered charity is and relate it to some of the business forms we talked about. Now, just imagine that that could be a not-for-profit corporation, could be a trust, either of those regardless of form. You know, maybe you have trustees instead of directors, but you've got members that you're ultimately accountable for, but it's that additional registration to that entity that makes it a registered charity, which can then have the benefits of being a registered charity. The big benefit of being a registered charity, does anyone know what that is? Or want to take a guess?
HST, they're paying tax.
Okay, so there's two really big benefits. Yeah, so being able to have tax exemptions on a lot of the activities and revenue that you bring in, absolutely. What's the other, thank you, major benefit? Yes.
You can issue tax receipts.
Yes, you can issue tax-deductible receipts for donors, to donors for donations, okay? So that's really the biggest benefit to being a registered charity. CRA has vetted you. They understand that you're doing something for a charitable purpose in their mind and that you have certain controls, transparency, accountability in their eyes built in. And so they give you, through your charitable registration, the privilege of being able to give a tax-deductible receipt to donors. Okay? This can be a major benefit in terms of fundraising, especially if the folks who are donating to your organization are high net worth individuals who would really benefit from a tax-deductible donation. If there are other folks who want to donate to your organization who may not benefit so much from a tax-deductible donation, they might donate anyway. Or you may also get sponsorship or lots of other ways to fundraise money. So just really important to know that that's really one of the main benefits, but you can still access a lot of the benefits by being simply a not-for-profit that isn't registered as well. Thank you. Okay. One reason, I don't want to say that most of the advice I give to folks who say, should I register a charity, is no, don't register a charity, but I do give that advice an awful lot, being honest with everyone here. And it's for some of the reasons we're going to talk about today. If it suits your purpose to be a registered charity, excellent, right? That's great. You have lots of high net worth individuals who are going to donate to you and you're going to give them a tax deductible receipt, keep them coming back year after year. You might get access to additional grants that you might not otherwise as a not registered charity. But it does come with a whole lot of restriction. And this is one example of what that restriction is. So when we hear charitable purpose, we all might have an idea about what that means. But to be a registered charity, what a charitable purpose is what the government tells us it is. Okay, so it is probably more narrow than we might all immediately think. So there are four main heads of what is considered a charitable purpose at law in Canada, and they're up on the board there. Relief of poverty, the advancement of education, advancement of religion, and other. Other is a category that is continually evolving, but things like protecting the environment and promoting health, these are things that are already recognized by the courts as being other charitable purposes at law. Okay, so some of the benefits of not registering as a charity. Okay, so we talked about this already. You still have the choice of whether you want to incorporate or not, whether you want to benefit from that limited liability protection or not. Not-for-profit corporations can later decide to become charities by making an application, but they don't have to do so. Okay, so really think about it as an additional optional step for a not-for-profit corporation to take. Okay, not-for-profits are not as restricted as you saw those purposes on the slide previous. So there's a lot more flexibility in terms of the social purpose, community purpose that a not-for-profit can conduct its activities under. And some of the things on the slide there would indicate that. So social welfare, civic improvement, pleasure, sports, recreation. A lot of those things in particular wouldn't be considered charitable purposes, although we might consider them to be, community benefits, social purposes, and that type of stuff. They may not be charitable purposes at law. Okay. Another major benefit to not registering as a charity is that it does help you avoid or not be subject to additional reporting requirements. And there's a lot of compliance involved if you are a registered charity. This is one of the main reasons why I do advise against registering as a charity to folks, is it's related to the compliance. Some registration as charity endeavors can take 3 years, a year to clean up the organization, a year to work on the application, a year to wait for the government to come back and tell you yes. Okay, so it can be a very exhausting process, and for lots of not-for-profits, everyone's wearing multiple hats. It's a lot to ask to have people devote such a long period of time on an application process and on things like compliance. And someone will have to be responsible for those things going forward. So not to say don't do it, but at least have eyes open if you do want to do it and recognize what the benefits are and know whether they're going to support you or not. All right. I'm so sorry. I have more flexibility in fundraising, asterisk as well. I could probably have asterisks at the end of all of those sentences. I mentioned earlier that charities can have more access to grants. That can definitely be the case, but more and more and more, we do see a lot of grants being available to not-for-profits and charities. There might be some preferential treatment given to charities, but lots of grants are available not only to not-for-profits, but also some businesses as well. Okay, some of the limitations. You can receive donations, but you cannot issue your tax-deductible receipts. You have to be a registered charity to do that. You may have some of your activities be taxed, although there's a lot of room to not have them taxed as well. This is a limitation more against a business corp, but you can't raise capital through equity financing. You can't have equity investors because there are no shares. You're a corporation without your capital. Thanks. Okay, and even though I was putting down charities so much, there are some real benefits. So I just want to summarize some of these here. Main one being, of course, can issue your official donation receipts for income tax purposes. Asterisk, asterisk. Okay, so I wanted to mention 2 things about tax-deductible receipts that registered charities can issue. Number 1, we cannot give tax-deductible receipts for services received in kind. Okay, it's for money or stuff that an entity can receive and then give a receipt back for. So if someone wants to donate their time, even time that would be otherwise something they might charge you for, professional fees or something like that, you're not able to give a tax-deductible receipt for that type of contribution. Okay? We have an example of this coming up later, but there's a concept called split receipting. So if I have a charitable dinner and it costs $1,000 to come, you all come, pay your $1,000, come to my charitable dinner. I can't give you a receipt for all of the $1,000 because you also came and ate something. So I have to deduct what it was that you received from the tax-deductible receipt that I give back to you. You start to see how annoying some of this stuff can get. The law is always evolving on this front, and we see that a lot with statutory law. So, it was the case at one time that you could give a receipt for the whole $1,000, and that would encourage like people to come and that type of stuff. Now we have to make these allowances for what people receive in return. Okay, so charitable dinners or a golf tournament, that type of stuff, you have to deduct from what you're giving people tax credit for. Okay, so this huge, huge, huge benefit does have some limitations on its own. Okay. Primary exemption from paying income tax, very helpful as a charity. Not-for-profit corporations may also benefit from that. I do think this is an important one to talk about, perception from the public in terms of trust and recognition. I do think, you all tell me what you think about when you hear about a charity, but I do think there is a perception from amongst the public that charities are more trustworthy or have been vetted or have more accountability in terms of their funds. That is not necessarily the case. It might be the case, but I do think there is some perception of that, which might entice someone to want to become registered as a charity for that reason. And grant eligibility. So I mentioned this a few times, but you probably do get your pick of grants the most as a registered charity. Some limitations. All really goes to compliance. So government oversight, needing to report on lots of things, all of your spending. And there are also restrictions in terms of political activities. So you're not able to lobby as a registered charity at all. Or very, 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 very little, I should say. And you can't engage in political activities either. Yes?
Are there the same restrictions on non-profits?
No.
Okay.
Big benefit to operating as a not-for-profit. You can lobby the government to come up with laws that serve you. You know who lobbies a lot? Business corps, right? So this is one way to really, there's a real impact happening, where registered charities are not able to lobby, right? And that's okay if that suits you. For some organizations who carry on a social purpose, it might be essential to them, really important to them that they're able to lobby, or to speak out about political developments. And that whole notion of political activities, I spent years of my life working on this. I will not bore you with the details, but that's really interpreted super, super broadly by CRA and charities who have even done things like an MP's post on social media can be, we've got some horror stories up here to point you to, but they could be audited for their carrying on of political activities. Okay, so further to our compliance, we wanted to give some examples of some of the risks that arise from not complying or maybe not complying and someone wants to look into it, and it's about audit. I don't know if folks remember or have heard about kind of some targeted CRA audits that have happened at times, but it is interesting to see what types of organizations can be targeted for audits. And at the time when I was working in the political activity space for charities, there was a lot of activity on audits directed towards environmental charities, okay, who were also, advocating for environmental protection, which is lobbying, or asking their government representatives things to do with environmental protection. That's political activities, right? And it all is up to interpretation, of course, but being subject to an audit is something that can be really, really difficult for an organization, especially an organization where people are wearing many hats. There's maybe not enough resources to go around, and you're working with volunteers and all sorts of other challenges as well. Okay, so really good to be aware of some of the risks. Okay, I'm not going to spend too long on this, but we did want to just touch on the concept of what is a gift and that type of stuff. The law doesn't love gifts very much. But a gift has to be something given with no attachment whatsoever. And sometimes the law could even deem that it wasn't a gift, and they can say, even if there was no attachment, we're still going to take tax on that gift because that was like a transfer. That's another concern for another lecture, another night. But I just want to make the point that the law doesn't love gifts. Okay, so first of all, even deciding whether something would qualify legally as a gift is a hurdle to be considered. And then we have, like, how do we value that gift? You know, if it's money, that might be easier, but if it's an asset, artwork, something like that, it could be really, really challenging to value that gift. And then you have to think, I need to give a receipt for this at the end of the day. So there has to be some due diligence around that valuation process. So there can be a lot of effort required in that step as well. Okay, steps to making a gift might not be so simple, probably getting this impression on a few different things that we're saying. Sometimes people can give gifts with strings attached, so making sure that an organization spends it in a certain way, on certain activities, on certain equipment, within certain periods of time. Gifts can be wonderful, but sometimes it's important for organizations to not accept gifts, number one, if they're not able to carry out the terms attached to the gift. Number two, if it's not in alignment with their purposes, you know, and number three, if they're just, it's going to be too cumbersome to comply with the requirements that are attached to the gift. Okay? And then receipts and split receipting. So once you've done all that determination, is this a gift? What's this gift worth? Are we in a position to accept it? What can we put on the number that we're going to give to, on our receipt to our donor is where you end up. Okay. I think we have an activity next, perhaps. Oh, we don't.
Yeah, and we'll be planning on sending out slides afterwards. We have our emails. You can also reach out to us for them, but we just have like a couple charts here too that kind of just like help summarize some of the points that we were talking about. Just kind of like clearly say what the difference is between a not-for-profit or if you register as a charity. So now we have our interactive activity. So it is like a mini law school session, and something we do in law school a lot is do hypothetical questions. So we thought we'd get a little one up on the slides here for you. Really simulate the real experience. So the question is, a charity holds a golf tournament and charges $500 per entry. Entry includes participation, a dinner, and drink tickets. Sounds like a good time. The cost of one participant for the charity is $200. So how much should the charity issue in a donation receipt per entry? Wow.
Whoa, A++. Uh-oh. There's always a curve. There's always a curve. Thanks all for participating in that. Wanted to illustrate the whole point of split receiving. So this is a really easy to digest example, and we gave you the cost amount that's involved. But of course, if you're working for an organization, if you're the director of on the board of a charity, you know, you're the one that's going to have to be looking at these numbers, coming up with something reasonable that's defensible, and then proceeding from there.
So we thought we'd take like a few minute break, as well as we can take questions as well, and then we have a little bit more content afterwards. So we're thinking maybe like about 5 minutes if you want to stretch your legs as well and come back, or if you want to sit and ask us questions, we're happy to do that as well. So I see one here, which is, if you're based in Nova Scotia but are selling products across Canada, would you need to be registered / incorporated federally as well as provincially? So this is a great question. So essentially, if you are, I guess it would kind of depend. So if you're talking about like a corporation, if you wanted to sell products across Canada, the best way to go about that would be probably to incorporate federally. So if you kind of like view your business as having like a larger operations, it's cross country, usually it's recommended to go ahead and incorporate federally, because if you just incorporate in Nova Scotia, you'll actually have to apply separately to each province to operate your business there. And you're not allowed to have technically like a conflicting corporate name. So there can also be some issues around if you register in Nova Scotia and you want to go conduct your business in Ontario, someone has the same name as you registered in Ontario, can kind of like cause some issues maybe for like your branding or selling products. Whereas if you're incorporated federally, you'll still need to register in the province which you're like based out of. So if you're based in Nova Scotia, you'd still incorporate federally, then register with Nova Scotia. It's called an extra provincial registration. But in terms of like another business form, if it was like a sole proprietorship or partnership, you wouldn't need to be registered technically, but it always is a good idea to register your business name. So next question, is there a governmental tax on a gift and or donation?
Is that my question?
Mm.
Very good question. It does depend. Are we talking about a gift between individuals? Are they related by blood or family? Are we talking between corporations, trusts, not-for-profit corporations, business corporations? Oh, it just depends, okay? But how I would answer this question is like, yes, it's likely, unless you are giving a true at-law gift. I just want to give an example of that. So I could give Leo my laptop. I'm not going to, but I could do that. And the law, if I just said, this is for you, Leo, enjoy, and I walked away with no strings attached, the law might, asterisk, consider that a gift, okay? If I gave my laptop to my spouse, any guesses around how that might be different? Do you think it would be different at all? Who thinks the law cares about the gifts we give to our spouses? The law does care. The law does care, okay? And I use spouse just as an example, but if we're giving a gift to a family member, we can do that. We can give them a gift, but there's likely to be a tax consequence on that because they're related parties, okay? So yes and or no, depending on the situation. But I think it's a really good question. Whoever did give that question to us, appreciate it. Because it's underappreciated, I think, that there can be tax consequences for gifts. So thanks. All right. What are the benefits of becoming a community interest corporation? What an excellent question. We're going to talk about community interest corporation in the last few minutes that we have today, so maybe we'll proceed from here so we can answer that question. Very specific point. We have a short video here as well. So much better. So thanks for watching that video with us. But just wanted to talk about this concept of triple bottom line. Not sure if folks have heard that expression before, but it is one of the ways that people sometimes describe social enterprise as, you know, not only being about profit, but it being about other considerations as well. Of course, if we're talking about profit at all, pop quiz, what type of structure are we talking about? Not-for-profit or business corp? Business corp, yay, A+. There can be, of course, no profit on the not-for-profit side. So in that description of a triple bottom line social enterprise, that's firmly on the business corp side because one of the lines that we're talking about at all is profit, okay? So just seeing the different ways that that shows up.
Yeah, I guess just to build on like what Elena said, the like triple bottom line or social purpose can really go a long way. Just thinking back to like that spectrum we discussed at the start. So this like kind of chart just highlights like essentially the considerations and that would go into like when you're choosing which legal structure to go by, as well as some of like the considerations around liability, tax, what purpose your social enterprise might be best suited for. So I definitely encourage you, if you're interested in getting the slides after, to reach out to us and you can reference this as well.
All right. Whoever asked about the CICs, here is your answer. Not sure if you'll like the answer, but we did want to spend a moment or two to talk about these two special forms of social enterprise, community contribution companies and community interest companies. Okay, so obviously at least one person in the room has heard about these because we got that question. But have folks generally heard these terms before, or is this the first time you're hearing them tonight? New to most folks in the room from the looks of it? Okay, so we are talking about the statutory law that we have in Canada. So our statutory law is one way that we're able to have corporations at all. And we talked about how those can be business corps or not-for-profit corps or business co-ops or not-for-profit co-ops. These types of structures, community contribution or community interest companies, are specific statutory frameworks for what are described as social enterprise. So the intention is that they kind of land in the middle, okay? The statute, the laws that allow these forms to be created requires certain reflection of that triple bottom line value, okay? So it can't only be about profit. There has to be rules reflected in the constitution of the entity that would require meeting these other purposes as well, okay? And that might restrict how much you can distribute profits. It also might require certain spending on other fronts. There's different ways that can be accomplished, but know that there are restrictions that come up with these examples. So these are only provincial creatures of statute. They exist only in Nova Scotia and BC. Okay. It's neat that we have these examples here, especially locally in Nova Scotia. They, I would say, are very underutilized as forms. They certainly could be used more. This is also an area, I might be responsible for this, but I do advise against going this route in a lot of situations, okay? And I want to give you some reasons for why. And it's not to say these are bad or that they won't work for some people, but I just want to point out for me as, putting legal eyes on the question, where my concerns would be, okay? So we've talked a lot about all these different types of forms, business corps, not-for-profits, co-ops, etc. There's a lot of flexibility that already exists between those forms. We're going to talk about this in a minute, but some organizations actually have multiple of those forms in place, right? So you might have a hospital that's actually a not-for-profit corporation, and it also might have a separate foundation, charitable foundation, to conduct its charitable activities. Super common. I challenge you all. Pick your favorite not-for-profit, a large not-for-profit, and you'll probably see some of this interesting structuring going on so that they're able to still lobby and have diverse fundraising efforts and avoid, certain compliance and that type of stuff, and then also benefit on the other side through certain of their activities, okay? So that's one of the reasons why this kind of hybrid form doesn't work for everyone, because it doesn't allow you to do both, okay? And you almost lose some of the benefits of both by trying to do both at the same time. The big, big, big issue with these entities is a tax issue. So we've talked about not-for-profits and or registered charities having a lot of tax benefits to them. Business corps pay tax on the income that they make. For these entities, there's a real question. Even if you have one of these entities and you carry out strictly what would otherwise be considered not-for-profit activities, you're going to pay for-profit tax on them if this is your entity. That's not a lot of fun, right? And also, by having that one form, you might actually deter something like an investor coming in if they're like, okay, but you're not able to give me dividends on my investment or something like that, right? Because you're restricted by your corporate structure. So that's what I mean by that last point, may not be flexible in the right ways to accommodate what it is that you might want to do. Who asked the question? You don't have to say. What about CICs? No pressure. Like I said, I don't know if you're going to like that answer, but that's what those vehicles are. It is important to know about them and to be able to recognize them. But always, just like the whole purpose of our lecture tonight, look beyond the terms and really drill down to what's happening there. Okay, macro organizational structuring, term we coined today. But this really is what I was just mentioning in terms of groups or organizations having multiple entities involved in their structure, whether that might be a not-for-profit corporation and also another corporation that's a registered charity, or whether that might be a business corporation that also, is carried on by similar people in a not-for-profit corporation as well. There might be shared activities, okay? For us at the clinic, we work with lots of folks in industries where they could choose to go the business corp route, or they could choose to go the not-for-profit corp route. Some examples of that would be, ocean sciences, health sciences, so many others, but those are two really good examples where, you might get a lot of benefit by incorporating an ocean sciences not-for-profit, have access to grants, but you might incorporate as a business corp for some of your other activities and get access to a whole bunch of other grants, right? And also equity investors. So I think it's a really good example of we can be creative. We have so many tools available at our disposal if we know who to call and know how to ask some questions about what it is that we want to do. There's a lot of options available. Okay, so by having some of these different forms, or at least thinking about using some of these different forms, we can really just give ourselves more options. So all of the benefits that we talked about in all of the different forms, you might be able to maximize on them within the same, loose organization, carrying out a certain mission, but via these different legal structures.
So we have another question for you. So a charitable organization has a fundraising event to collect donations from businesses. They raise $10,000. They have expenses related to the event, which amount to $2,000. What is the charity's profit and what is the total revenue?
Sorry for all the math. Everyone have their answers in? Ooh. Commentary?
Oh. Yeah, so as we kind of discussed earlier, charities technically can't earn a profit,
They
right?
just changed their mind. You were right.
So they can do fundraising activities and have revenue, but profit is more specific to a business corp or where you would have equity and shares and things related to that. So even just to kind of build, got the wrong slide. To build on that, just some basic points that revenue is the amount of money that an organization earns from the business operations. Well, income is the amount of money that business makes minus the cost of running the business. But profit is the amount of money an organization receives after it accounts for the cost of goods. So a charity, for example, can't necessarily have a profit because the money is going back into the charitable purpose. Fundraising, I guess, kind of self-explanatory, but it's obtained through donations, special events, planned giving, government grants or sponsorships, and other traditional forms of funding. So just kind of a roadmap, if you are thinking about starting your social enterprise, this kind of just reflects what you might want to consider. So the first point is just determining what your primary goal is, and then choosing a legal structure that reflects that goal, right? So if your main goal is to, earn a profit, to make money, then you might not want to necessarily think about a charity or a not-for-profit, right? You want to think about a business corp. While in contrast, if you really are wanting to start an organization to give back to your community, then you might want to lean more on the social enterprise towards a not-for-profit. Then you might want to assess what your risk tolerance is and whether it's worth incorporating. Do you want to avoid being personally liable for the assets? How big is the organization you're planning? Is it going to grow? And that will kind of determine what ownership structure is going to be right for you. And then you also are going to want to consider whether you want to be a tax exempt organization. And just going from that point into more of the legal risk management stuff, you really want to ensure that you're keeping good records, being clear on where things are going to be allocated, especially if you have multiple entities. So building on what Elena said, in terms of, if you're going to have a business corporation for some things, and then you're also going to have a not-for-profit for others, when you are making these structures or starting your social enterprise, you want to be clear on what's going to each entity. So if something happens in the future, it'll be a lot more clear. And another key point is just building the right team. So having the right employees, volunteers in place, directors, officers, and then implementing and following a lot of those effective policies that we discussed earlier. So having a policy to train your staff, having a policy to ensure that your employees are going to be free from harassment in the workplace, right? Those are good ways to really ensure that your organization's working for the right purpose, and as well as reducing your liability. And you can also do that without incorporating in some aspects, right? Having effective policies, having insurance in place. These are things you can do without incorporating if you decide that's not the right approach for you. And then just kind of like building upon what we said as well, is you can also flow donations from a charity to a not-for-profit. So that's another way to consider getting funding if you want to go the not-for-profit route. Maybe there's a charity in a similar area, or a charity that you work really close with. There is a way for you to flow those donations to your non-for-profit, so they can issue tax donation receipts, and you can get more funding.
Can I just ask then, charities can't necessarily give gifts to other charities. The charity flowing things to non-profits.
So charities can only give gifts. Excellent question. Gifts, here you go, no strings attached, to other charities.
Yeah.
So this is one of the limitations of being a charity. But of course, if you're working with other charities, no problem. But they can only give gifts to other charities. They can still work with others. Okay? So we're calling it kind of flowing donations, but you could still hire someone. You can work with a not-for-profit and cover their fees. A not-for-profit can also, direct its donations through a charity if their purposes are aligned, and actually get the charity that received the money to issue the receipt. So there's a lot of flexibility if you know how to work around the flexibility that's allowed. But really good question. Yes.
I have a question, it's a bit too long to put into the chat.
Oh, good. Love to hear it.
So if I was a principal shareholder in multiple for-profit companies that had a real good social conscience, the type of work we did, but I wanted to kind of employ the social good in a more formal way. Just started up a not-for-profit to be alongside of the for-profits. What would be some of the things to think about as far as good governance and key points to keep in mind, like if we were to put some resources into the not-for-profit, but understanding that the for-profits can't benefit off of the.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think honestly, you're almost answering your own question by thinking about the flow of the direction of the funds. So, so Business Corp could fund not-for-profit, can't go the other way, right? So just thinking about, where assets and resources are going. But I think there's all sorts of ways to, enshrine values about community supports or triple bottom line practices or anything like that, within bylaws or policies as well, or just commitments to investing or donating in particular ventures. Absolutely. So there's so many more things I could say, limited on time. Super happy to talk to you after the presentation as well. But there are options, regardless of what structure you're in, to go far above and beyond, what the statute would require you to do, for sure. It's really interesting. I'm just conscious of the time. We prepared so much material because we are obsessed with this topic. So we have more than what we'll be able to cover today, but we'd love to still share the information with you all. The balance of the presentation was mostly about risk management strategies, the folks that you work with, using waivers, volunteer agreements, insurance, all that type of stuff. All really important things that do deserve their appropriate time. But if you do want a copy of our slides, please reach out to us and we'd be happy to provide them to you. We'd also be happy to talk about any of these things or any of the other things that we do at the clinic: business structuring, contracts, liability protection, privacy policies, all that type of stuff. I also have business cards here if anyone does want to take one and get in touch later. We'll hang out for a little bit, so if you're not in a rush, you're welcome to stay and continue to ask questions to us, but we also don't want to keep you past mini law school hour. So thank you all so much. Thank you, Leo, so much. Senior law student, crushing it.